That's better. Hello, here we are again in the Planetracker Golf Lab. My name's Alan Henry, founder of Planetracker Golf, and as you know, we're proposing a new model for the golf swing. I am presuming that you've seen our the first video that we produced, which was called the Planetracker Hypothesis. The idea is to produce a series of short videos which follow the implications of that hypothesis. This is the first one of those videos, entitled The Secret of Clubhead Speed. You'll remember in the first video we introduced you to the concept of a two-lever pendulum. Now, two-lever pendulum is a mechanical device consisting, of course, of two levers attached by a hinge between them. So there's a pivot point, and you can do this with such a device. You can cause the outer lever to rotate violently around the inner lever, around the hinge. And you get this flicking action, which we call a release. The outer lever releases around the inner lever. Now, that happens in a golf swing, but not quite the way people have been taught. The Planetracker hypothesis that we proposed in the first video is that actually the system works this way. You've got an axis which is loosely associated with your spine, and as that axis turns, it carries an invisible primary lever with it. When you look at it that way, it's quite easy to imagine a system where, by looking down the axis, you can visualize in this plane the primary lever rotating around the axis in a perfectly circular way. This here represents the hinge, so ideally you could have a system where the hands rotate around the axis in a perfect circle. Now, in the late 1960s, such a machine was invented, called the iron biron, on the premise that you have an axis, a motor driving the axis, a primary lever attached to the axis, a hinge, and a secondary lever attached to the hinge, forming a two-lever pendulum. And here it is from the front. So the traditional picture of the two-lever pendulum in the golf swing has been of a primary lever attached to a secondary lever, and then through this release, the release starting right from the top, opening up, that angle opening up until it straightens up here past the ball, and then closing on the other side. What actually happens in the golf swing is that the hands, and I'll use just one hand here just to make it easier, the hands get some distance away from the axis in the backswing, and they don't start to form a consistent radius around the axis until the upper arm slams into the side of the torso and starts to turn around like that. It's only from here to there that you get anything like a properly circular movement of the hands, which is the hinge. So in a real golf swing, at first, there is no primary lever. There's only a secondary lever being held by the hands outside of that circle that we're trying to create. There comes a point where the upper arm slams into the torso, creates a primary lever with a constant radius, all the way to that point where the primary lever and the secondary lever are in a straight line. Implication number one: whenever something turns in a circle, describes a circle, it does so in conjunction with what's called a centripetal force towards the center. And if you haven't got a perfect circle, you really haven't got a centripetal force. Centripetal force, real centripetal force is something that holds an object in a circular motion. In other words, in the case of the golf swing, centripetal force is created at the instant the primary lever is created, because at that point you've got a constant radius and you've got an object going around in a circle. I've tried to show that centripetal force with these arrows here. There's a centripetal force appears here and carries on until the two levers are in line. After that, the moment the hands leave that circle, no more centripetal force. Implication number 2, Newton's third law, which requires that to every force there is an equal and opposite force. It's normally stated as to every action there is an opposite and equal reaction. In the case of this diagram, Newton's third law still implies you have a force appearing. Well, it must appear in conjunction with another force equal in size but in the opposite direction. In the case of the golf swing, the force which is opposite to that one there it doesn't apply here, it applies there on the center of mass of the club. And it stays there as long as a centripetal force exists. So here we go, equal and opposite reaction, equal and opposite reaction there. And finally, you get to this stage where the equal and opposite reaction cancel each other out because they're in the same line. And what happens is that as long as that yellow force exists, it accelerates the secondary lever around the hinge. That is what's effectively creating the release. And that release persists and the acceleration persists as long as that yellow force exists. We could call it the releasing force. There. After that, the force disappears. And at that point, the club head is carried around purely under the action of its own momentum, nothing more. Now, why is this so important? Well, it means that effectively, if you want to swing a golf club harder, you have to increase the centripetal force. Because the greater the centripetal force, the greater the releasing force that flicks the club around the hinge. Now, there's another way of looking at it as well, and it does matter. There is a transfer of energy between the primary lever system and the secondary lever system. So all the energy of the primary lever actually goes out in this process into the secondary lever. Now that has implications as well. Therefore, the more energy you can put into the primary lever when you form it, as it forms, the more energy it has, the more energy will go into the secondary lever in the form of kinetic energy. But the energy you place into the primary lever doesn't come from circular kinetic energy, it comes from effort, work done by the back muscles to bring your hands down to that point. That's where the energy starts. There's an energy sequence, if you like. You take the club back, load it with energy. The faster you do that, the faster your hands are traveling when they form a primary lever, and therefore the faster they'll go from there to there, and the faster the secondary lever will accelerate to hit the ball. That's where club head speed comes from. It has everything to do with the amount of energy you give the hands at the point where you form the primary lever. Problem. There's only so much energy in the system. You've bought it, you've spent it there, and then when the hands go from here to here, you're transferring that energy to the club. Now, as the club acquires more and more energy as it accelerates, the hands will therefore have a tendency to slow down. And if you're not careful, the club will overtake the hands. It's just a natural consequence of it having a 2-lever pendulum. And you don't want that. So, associated with that movement and the slowing of hands, you have to provide rotational energy to the axis. You have to provide torque to the axis and more rotational energy, really rotational work, to compensate for the loss of energy of the hands and to make sure that they stay ahead of the club head. So there we are. You want club head speed, or you want more club head speed. Ultimately, you're going to have to increase the centripetal force on the hands during the release. More centripetal force is associated with faster turning hands. To do that, 2 ways really. One is to rotate the shoulders violently around the axis. That's one, because that sends the hands into circular motion during the release. The other way is to actually produce a force towards the center by pushing against the ground. So these two actually work together. You see how the shoulders turn while I'm pushing up against the ground to create centripetal force towards the center, towards the axis. Now, there are, of course, many strategies that you can employ to cause the hands to rotate very quickly around the axis of your upper body. And of course, each one of those strategies has coaching implications. Now, that's for another video. What we set out to do is to answer the question, where does club head speed come from? Now, I hope I've done that. I hope it's been useful. And I trust that you'll be able to take this information, give it a bit of thought, and maybe take it away to the driving range and try a few things. Maybe you could find strategies of your own. Meanwhile, it's been a pleasure. Happy golfing.